There is a specific kind of pressure that does not announce itself. It does not arrive in the locker room with a warning or appear on the stat sheet before tip-off. It builds quietly, accumulating across weeks and months of playing inside an environment that was never fully designed to welcome you, where the physicality aimed at you carries intention beyond basketball, where the whistles seem calibrated to a frequency you cannot access, and where the people whose organizational obligation is to stand between you and all of it have developed a troubling habit of looking the other way. Caitlin Clark stepped onto the floor against the Connecticut Sun carrying all of that, not as a complaint, not as an excuse, as the specific, documented, invisible weight of a player who has learned that the protection she should be able to count on is not something she can count on at all. She has learned to play through it. That much is undeniable. The offensive production, the court vision, the competitive composure she maintains, while navigating a physical environment that no other player in this league faces with the same consistency, all of it reflects someone who has made an internal decision to perform regardless of what the institutional structure around her is or is not doing. But performance under pressure and protection from deliberate harm are two entirely different things. One is a measure of individual character, the other is an organizational responsibility. And on this particular night, against this particular opponent, inside this particular building, the distance between what Clark deserved and what her organization provided was about to become impossible to ignore. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, consider subscribing. There's more where this came from. Sophie Cunningham did not arrive in professional basketball as a polished institutional product. She came from the kind of competitive background that builds something harder and more durable than skill it builds conviction. The Montana native carved her identity inside programs and environments where toughness was not a coaching buzzword, but a daily operating requirement, where standing next to your teammate when the game got physical was not optional, and where the culture of a locker room was something you defended with your presence, not just your words. That formation matters here, because what happened when Brittney Griner delivered that elbow was not a spontaneous emotional explosion from a player who lost her composure. It was the completely predictable response of someone whose entire competitive identity was built around a single, non-negotiable principle: you do not leave your teammate standing alone in a space that should never have been empty in the first place. Caitlin Clark's formation was different in geography and circumstance, but identical in its core demand. West Des Moines, a gym, a father who understood that the game would eventually ask her questions that no coach could answer for her, and that the only preparation worth building was the kind that happened before anyone was watching. The crossover that became a signature, the vision that looks like instinct but is actually thousands of repetitions of reading a defense before it fully forms, the competitive stillness she carries into hostile environments, none of it arrived fully assembled. It was constructed quietly, specifically, in the unseen hours that precede every visible moment of excellence. Two players, two formations, one shared understanding of what it means to show up for the person beside you when the institution around you has decided not to. Every professional basketball organization carries an internal logic, a set of values, priorities, and decision-making instincts that reveal themselves not in the press releases or the preseason media days, but in the specific moments when the situation demands something difficult, and the institution either rises to meet it, quietly steps back. The Indiana Fever entered this season with a franchise-altering talent on their roster, and a coaching staff whose philosophical approach to the environment surrounding that talent has been, at best, a study in institutional passivity. Stephanie White is not an inexperienced coach operating without context. She understands what Caitlin Clark means to this organization, commercially, competitively, and culturally, which makes the pattern of non-response to Clark's physical targeting not a question of awareness, but a question of organizational priority, and what that priority reveals about the system Clark and Cunningham are both operating inside is something that this particular game made impossible to continue ignoring. The WNBA itself represents a second institutional layer that shapes everything happening on that floor, a league that has navigated a specific and complicated relationship with its most visible new player, one whose arrival generated commercial outcomes the league had been building toward for decades, but whose presence also exposed fault lines in the culture that veteran players had built and protected across years of operating without that level of external attention. The institutional forces at work in this game are not abstract. They are present in the officiating decisions, in the physical messaging delivered by veteran players, and in the coaching responses that either challenge those forces or accommodate them. What the Indiana Fever system has communicated most clearly across this season is which of those two options it has been choosing, and the players inside that system have been receiving that communication with complete clarity. Beneath the visible drama of an elbow and a foul call, this game contained a second contest entirely. One played not between Caitlin Clark and Brittney Griner, but between Clark and an officiating environment that had revealed its tendencies long before the fourth quarter arrived. The screen Clark set against the Golden State Valkyries earlier in the season, the one that drew immediate and aggressive whistle attention, established a baseline. Officials were watching her physicality with a level of scrutiny that bordered on disqualifying. That baseline matters because it created the exact inverse of what happened against Griner, a moment where deliberate, elevated contact to the face drew no call at all. The gap between those two officiating responses is not a coincidence or an inconsistency. It is a pattern. And patterns in officiating reveal institutional posture more honestly than any press conference ever could. Sophie Cunningham's read of the floor in real time reflects a different kind of game intelligence, not the offensive variety that shows up in box scores, but the protective awareness that veteran competitors develop after years of understanding exactly when a teammate has been left exposed. She was tracking Griner's physicality before the elbow landed, processing the officiating, silence as it accumulated possession after possession, and registering Stephanie White's non-response in real time as the bench did nothing. That accumulated read is what produced the speed and certainty of her reaction. This was not a player operating on pure emotion. This was a player who had already run the calculation, coaching staff, unresponsive, officials compromised, teammate exposed, and arrived at the only conclusion the math allowed. There is a specific moment in every difficult season when accumulated pressure stops being something a player can quietly absorb and becomes something that demands a visible response. For Caitlin Clark, that moment has arrived repeatedly across this year in different forms in screens that drew technical scrutiny while opposing contact went unpunished, in possessions where the physicality crossed from competitive into something more deliberate, and in post-game moments where the institutional response to all of it amounted to silence. The elbow from Brittney Griner was not an isolated fracture point. It was the latest and most visible expression of a pressure that had been building beneath the surface of a season. Clark has navigated largely without the protection a franchise player should reasonably expect from her own organization. What makes this fracture point different is not the severity of the contact itself, but the completeness of the institutional failure that surrounded it, officiating, coaching, and organizational response all arriving at the same inadequate place simultaneously. For Sophie Cunningham, the fracture point looked different, but originated from the same accumulated source. She had absorbed an entire season of watching the targeting campaign against her teammate continue without meaningful consequence, had taken her own institutional punishment for speaking publicly about it, and had returned anyway because her commitment to Clark existed independent of what the organization was willing to do about it. When the elbow landed and Stephanie White's response consisted of 2 words directed at the player who got hit rather than any acknowledgement of the player who delivered it, something in Cunningham's patience reached its structural limit. What do you think shaped this moment more, the specific elbow itself, or the season of accumulated silence that preceded it? Leave your thoughts below. What separates Caitlin Clark's game from the players who possess comparable physical tools is not visible during the 40 minutes a national audience watches her play. It is visible in the hours. Nobody films the repetition of a logo three-pointer until the motion becomes indistinguishable from breathing. The film sessions where she studies not just her own tendencies, but the defensive rotations of every team she will face that season. The deliberate construction of a competitive mindset that can withstand exactly the kind of hostile physical environment she encountered against Griner. That preparation does not announce itself with footage. It reveals itself only in the moment when the pressure arrives, and the player either has the internal architecture to absorb it or does not. Clark's response to an entire season of targeted physicality, continuing to produce, continuing to compete, continuing to elevate her team, even in a game decided by the narrowest of margins, is not an accident of talent. It is the direct output of preparation built specifically for moments exactly like this one. Sophie Cunningham's unseen hours carry a different signature, but the same underlying discipline. The hours spent understanding not just her own role, but the protective function she has assigned herself within this specific roster, tracking patterns of physicality across games, building the situational awareness that allows her to recognize the precise moment when a teammate has been left exposed, conditioning herself physically and mentally to respond immediately rather than deliberate when that moment arrives. What looked to outside observers like a sudden eruption was, beneath the surface, the product of preparation that had been quietly accumulating across an entire season of watching, processing, and readying herself for exactly the situation that unfolded against Griner. The bond between Clark and Sophie Cunningham did not form through scripted team-building exercises or organizational messaging about chemistry. It formed through the accumulated experience of two players navigating an unusually difficult season together, one carrying the weight of being the most physically targeted player in the league, the other choosing repeatedly, publicly, and at personal cost to stand visibly beside her. Cunningham's willingness to absorb institutional consequences for defending Clark, to take public positions that put her at odds with the league's preferred narrative, to physically insert herself into moments where protection was required and not otherwise provided. All of it built a relationship defined not by comfortable team chemistry, but by something closer to genuine loyalty forged under pressure. That distinction matters, because loyalty tested under difficult circumstances tends to reveal something more durable than chemistry built under easy ones. What makes this relationship particularly significant within the broader context of Clark's season is the contrast it creates with the institutional relationships surrounding her, where the coaching staff's response to physical targeting has been passive, where the officiating environment has been inconsistent at best. Cunningham's response has been immediate, consistent, and unambiguous. She has become, by both circumstance and choice, the connective tissue between Clark and a locker room that the broader organization has struggled to fully unify around her. The 2-hour meeting Stephanie White acknowledged, the documented internal division, the fractures running beneath the surface of this franchise, all of it makes Cunningham's specific, demonstrated commitment to Clark not just a teammate dynamic worth noting, but possibly the single most stabilizing relationship inside an organization otherwise defined by its instability. The fourth quarter against Connecticut required something specific from both players, and watching how each of them delivered it reveals more about their competitive identities than any highlight package could capture in isolation. Clark's offensive execution down the stretch, the floor reading under exhaustion, the willingness to take difficult shots when the offense had stalled, the composure required to perform at an elite level while still processing the physical toll of what Griner had delivered earlier in the game, reflected a player operating with a kind of compartmentalized focus that most competitors never develop. She did not allow the institutional failure surrounding her to dictate her performance. She absorbed all of it and produced anyway, which is its own form of resilience that deserves recognition independent of the surrounding controversy. Cunningham's contribution to that same fourth quarter carried a different texture but an equally specific intentionality. Her scoring down the stretch arrived not as an isolated offensive performance, but as part of a broader competitive statement. She was not simply trying to help Indiana win a basketball game against a depleted Connecticut roster. She was demonstrating, through sustained physical and competitive pressure, that the Fever's response to a difficult night would not be passive. The back-to-back flagrant fouls that followed her confrontation with Griner were not incidental. They were the visible consequence of a player who had decided the physical campaign against her teammate would carry an actual cost, even if the institution around her had decided it would not enforce one. Box scores will record that Clark contributed to a narrow victory over Connecticut. They will not record the elbow she absorbed, the foul call that landed on her rather than the player who initiated contact, or the specific psychological toll of playing an entire season inside an environment where the protection most players take for granted has been conspicuously, repeatedly absent. The statistics measure output. They do not measure the cost of producing that output under conditions that no comparable player in the league has had to navigate with the same consistency. What Clark's season has demonstrated, beneath every counting statistic, is a form of resilience that the traditional measures of basketball excellence were never designed to quantify the capacity to keep performing at an elite level while absorbing institutional failure after institutional failure, without that absorption visibly compromising her competitive output. Sophie Cunningham's legacy within this specific season will not be fully captured by her statistical contributions either, meaningful as they have been. What she has built through a season of public advocacy and now physical confrontation on Clark's behalf is something closer to organizational leadership than conventional teammate support. The kind of leadership that does not require a title or a captaincy, but emerges instead from a consistent willingness to act when the people with formal authority decline to. In an organization whose head coach has demonstrated a pattern of institutional passivity at the moments that mattered most, Cunningham has effectively assumed a protective function the coaching staff abdicated. That is not something any traditional statistic will reflect. but it may be the most significant development of Indiana's season. What happens next inside the Indiana Fever organization will reveal whether this specific game functions as a turning point or simply another entry in an accumulating pattern. The questions are not complicated, even if the organizational response to them has been. Will Stephanie White adjust her approach to protecting Clark in real time? Or will the next deliberate physical confrontation produce the same passive response that defined this one? Will the front office address the documented internal division that White herself acknowledged? Or will the 2-hour meetings continue without producing visible change? And will the league's officiating environment begin reflecting the same scrutiny toward contact against Clark that it has reflected toward her own physicality? Or will the gap between those two standards continue to widen? None of these questions have been answered yet, but the visibility this game created, Cunningham's response, White's press conference, the documented pattern of targeting, has made the stakes of those unanswered questions considerably harder for the organization to ignore. For Clark and Cunningham specifically, what this season has built is a relationship that will likely outlast whatever organizational dysfunction continues to surround it. Their story is not finished. It is, if anything, just beginning to reveal its real shape. Two players from different backgrounds, bound together by a shared willingness to compete under conditions that would have discouraged less resilient competitors, building something that the institution around them has not yet figured out how to fully support. Where that story goes next remains genuinely uncertain. And that uncertainty is precisely what makes it worth continuing to watch. If this story moved you, a like means more than you might think. And if you want to see what comes next, we will be here.